And good afternoon. This is Mckoy, and we are on Talk of the Heartland on this fine day. And I have a great guest today. I can't wait for you to meet him. The first time I met, I call him up and I say, I want to have you on the radio. And he's like, what do you want to talk about? And I said, no, I just want to talk about you and what you do for a living. He said, well, let's meet first and talk about it, which I really respect. I wish I had that opportunity more often, but people don't sometimes have the kind of time. But his name is Chase Becker, right?
That's correct.
All right. And he is the liturgist at St. John's Parish, which is on the Creighton University campus. And I had the most wonderful experience to go there. It was before Christmas, right?
Yes.
And you guys were all decked out.
Oh, it was beautiful.
Oh, that is, I was born into Catholicism, and so I went to beautiful Catholic church and then Episcopalian churches and then eventually Lutheran churches now all my life. And that is a beautiful, beautiful church. How old is that church?
It was built in 1887, was when the original structure was built, and then it was added onto in the 1920s. Been remodeled a number of times than that, but it's just a beautiful historic building right in the heart of Creighton's campus, and it really is the heart and soul of the campus, and we're really fortunate to have that both at Creighton as well as here in the city of Omaha.
Yeah, it is an absolute beautiful place. And how old did you say?
1887. Now, math isn't my strong suit, so people
That's
are
all
going to
right.
have to figure that out.
It's 232 years old.
Yeah, something like that.
How about that? Yeah,
that'll work.
232. All right, now I'm just getting in a date so you and I can do this properly. Today's the 23rd, and your name again is Chase Becker.
That's me.
H-A-S-E?
C-H-A-S-E.
All right.
You know, when I was a kid, we were learning the parts of speech in elementary school, and we were learning about, the different, sentence parts and all of that, and I came home very distraught. And I looked at my mother and I said, Mom, why did you name me a verb?
A verb? Oh, that's right. It is, isn't it?
Yeah, and she said, oh, that's not what we were going for.
Well, probably my best friend in the world, her son's name is Chase. And so when I hear that, I think of him. I don't think of Run, Spot, Run or anything like that, right?
Yeah, right.
All right. So let's get a little background.
Sure.
You are from where?
I grew up in Exeter, Nebraska, which is a small town of about 500 people, about an hour west of Lincoln.
Okay.
So just a nice small community, and that's where my family roots run very deeply. That's where my great-great-grandfather settled when he came over from Germany. I grew up on the farm that he farmed himself, and so I feel a real sense of rootedness in that part of the world.
So it's west on 80?
Yeah, it's on Highway 6. So your listeners might be familiar with the towns of York or Geneva.
Sure.
It's near there.
Yeah, Highway 6 would be usually Highway 6. Well, Highway 6 used to be the interstate.
Yeah, that was the main east-west road.
Yeah, and then Highway 30, which was north of that, was called the Lincoln Highway. Mm-hmm. And both of those basically went from one end of the country to the other. So how far are you from Arapahoe?
A ways.
A ways?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's my only thing I know about that area.
Fair.
And you are married to, what is her name?
Sure, my wife's name is Laura.
And she is a professional church musician?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
So,
what does she play?
So everything. So organ would be her primary instrument, but she does piano and other instruments as well, but also voice. Her own voice, but also being able to conduct choirs. Okay. And really, with her background in sacred music, I mean, she really is kind of able to do it all.
Sure.
The experience of music and worship, that's her
so
area.
One of those organs that have like 3 keys and all the stuff you do with your feet, and all, she can do that.
That would be her, and she's way smarter than I am, so, it's a good thing I married up.
Yeah, I know the feeling.
Yeah.
I did too. And you have a little boy who's only about 6 months old?
Oh, not even that. About 4. So he was born at the end of September.
Okay. And his name is Alban.
Alban, yes.
A-L-B-E-N.
B-A-N.
B-A-N.
Yes.
Alban. And I have to ask, where did you ever hear that name? I've never heard it before. I love the name, but I've never heard it before.
Yeah, it's not at all common. So right after grad school, I moved to England, and I met my wife actually right before I left. So we dated long distance for about a year. But I lived in the city called St. Albans, and that's named after the saint who is buried there in the local cathedral. He was the first martyr of Britain. His name was Alban.
Ooh.
He
Ooh.
was a Roman soldier. He was pagan. But there was a priest who was fleeing from persecution, and somehow they met, and he took this priest into his home and sheltered him. And he watched this priest and how he prayed and the way he lived his life, and it was so inspiring to him that he wanted to be baptized. Soon enough, the Roman authorities came knocking at his door, and in a last-minute decision, Alban switched his clothes with the priest and presented himself at the door. Took him to court. They found out the ruse, and so they gave him the punishment that was intended for the priest, which was death. And so they buried him there in Verulamium was the name of the Roman settlement. And slowly people started making pilgrimages to his tomb and being inspired by his example and praying there. And it grew up to be a Benedictine abbey, later a cathedral. And he's still buried there.
Well, I was going to ask that because sometimes the Catholic Church will move saints and bury them or intern them inside of the Catholic Church in the Vatican.
Yeah, in this instance, the church really grew around his tomb. Now, today, it's an Anglican cathedral, and so, in the Reformation, through some historical research, it seems that the relics were squirreled away to one of their monasteries in Germany during the Reformation. But recently, they brought a portion of those relics back to the Anglican cathedral, and so he's come home in a sense. So it's a really kind of a neat story.
My guest today is Chase Becker. He is the liturgist for St. John's Parish, and that's on the Creighton University campus. And you are also the liturgist for Creighton University.
Correct, yeah, through campus ministry, but I really serve the whole university campus.
Yeah. So are you a professor?
I'm not. I don't teach.
You don't teach?
Yeah.
Okay. So what do you do for the campus?
That's usually the first question I get is when I tell people that I'm a liturgist, it's usually, well, what the heck is that?
Yeah.
And I think if I had to put it in really simple terms, I'm a holy event planner, right? So we have a lot of...
I like that name. That's good. A holy event planner.
Right. So we have a lot of services that take place over the course of a week at St. John's. So we have 2 masses every day. We have 5 on Sunday, as well as a bunch of different opportunities that come up throughout the week. It's my job to help coordinate the conversation around that, making sure everybody knows what's going on, that everybody has the tools that they need to do worship well. I work with students to train them to fill different roles within the liturgy, perhaps proclaiming the scriptures, perhaps setting up for Mass, those sorts of things. So it's really, there's both a practical element of it, making sure that our worship is done well and is being able to facilitate the conversations around that, but also to help form our students in what it means to worship. For Catholics, we follow a set ritual, which is kind of something that's foreign to our culture. So how do we help our students to engage in that ritual in a way that they can carry that into their everyday lives?
Chase Becker is my guest today. He is the liturgist. We're going to learn more about that today. In fact, I'll make a promise to you that by the time we're done with this first show, if you take the time to listen to it, you're going to be able to go to Mass and say, I know who the liturgist is. So, yeah. But you touched on it for a minute. You love history.
I do.
The history of worship, is that the right way to put it?
I would say yes. Yeah,
Right.
How have Christians engaged in praising God, throughout the centuries? I think that's utterly fascinating.
Well, I'll tell you what, I want you to share that with me, and we'll do that when we come back in 2 minutes. My name is Mac, and thank you for listening. I couldn't do this job without you. Always interested in your feedback, especially what we can do better. And that's Mac, M-A-C, like macaroni, at kcro.com. 3, 2. We are back with my special guest today, Chase Becker. He is the liturgist at St. John's Parish on the Creighton University campus and also the liturgist for the Creighton School. So what's the difference between doing it for the parish and doing it for the school.
Sure. And sometimes those areas are a little bit blurry, which is fine. But St. John's on the campus of Creighton is a parish church. So it would be just like any other Catholic church that you would find in this city, in that, we have, of course, our regular round of worship, but we also have religious education for school-age students. We have youth group. We have different committees and things like that you would expect to find in a normal parish situation. But being where we are, we also serve the university community as well. So primarily our students, but also our faculty and staff as well. So I would say my work with the parish is a year-round thing. We have services 365 days a year.
Yeah. Okay.
But that number scales back a little bit when school isn't in session. But it's just different needs for different groups of people. For example. I get asked sometimes to do various prayer services on the campus around different sort of things that might be going on, whether it's around contemporary events or maybe needs of different areas of students. Whereas parish, maybe it's a little bit more of a standard sort of experience that you might get. So it just kind of goes back and forth. And sometimes they're both. We have students, Creighton students, who teach, for example, our religious education. So there's a nice relationship between the university and the parish, and I think it's a pretty dynamic environment.
All right, so let me get this straight. You are a liturgist, which also is the person who sets up the services. You are a teacher in many ways, not a professor.
Not officially, but
right.
Yes.
Okay, so that would be my next question. Why aren't you a professor, or why did you choose not to be a professor? Or is that coming?
Well, I don't know about that, but I guess I don't know that it was a conscious decision. I've always been interested in worship and all of that, but when I went to grad school, actually my kind of intent to do that was I was interested in the liturgical arts. How does art help us to worship, and how could I perhaps help churches to think about that when they're doing renovations, when they're doing new construction, that sort of thing. But after I finished with my classes, there really wasn't a whole lot of work in that department. So I sort of fell in, I guess, what I'd call maybe more of a pastoral track, where I was doing work with parishes. And it's been a real blessing. It wasn't what I intended to do, but being able to work with people, I mean, that's where the rubber meets the road, right? It's what we do on Sunday.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's been a real blessing for me, especially to be able to do it in a dynamic environment like St. John's and Creighton.
All right. Did you start at Creighton after high school?
No, I actually went to the seminary. So I was studying to be a Catholic priest.
Yes.
I graduated from undergrad there. I was not ordained. I would have had to have continued for another 4 years for that. But after that, I decided, this isn't for me long term. And so I left, and I actually sold radio advertising for a while.
Did you tell me that?
I thought I did.
Where at?
At KTIC in West Point.
Oh, sure.
Yep.
Okay.
And so that was a really wonderful.
How'd you do on that?
Well, I think pretty well.
Would you like a part-time job?
Yeah, right. Well, they keep me pretty occupied down there.
I know. We're always looking for good people to represent KCR on the street. So, all right, so when did you go to Britain? Because you went through seminary.
Yep.
And then you sold little radio after that.
Yep, then went to grad school.
Okay.
And then after that is when I went to England. So that would have been like 2012, 2013.
And was going to Britain part of grad school?
It wasn't.
Okay.
I was, like I said, my coursework was pretty much finished, and I was kind of complaining to a friend of mine that there really weren't many jobs available. And I said, you know what? I should just go to England or something. And she just looked at me and goes, well, why don't you? And I thought, oh, well, all my stuff is in storage, and I don't really have. Why not? I'll never have a better chance.
So, but why England? I mean, if she thought you should go there and you thought I could do that, what was it that you were going to do there that you weren't doing here?
Well, that's what I had to figure out.
Okay.
But, again.
Stupid question, Mac. Gets an answer. All right.
Well, remember, I love history, right? I love culture.
Oh,
and, of course, we have that in this country, but not in the way that they do in Europe. And here's the thing. I'm not real good at languages, so they kind of had that taken care of there.
Yeah.
So I looked around and I found an opening with the Archdiocese of Westminster, which is London. They had a youth retreat center there, an opening for a retreat leader that would help lead retreats for school-age kids there. And I thought, well, I can do that. And I applied for the job, and I got it. And it was a really wonderful experience.
Chase Becker is my guest today. He's the liturgist for St. John's Parish on the Creighton University campus. Just an amazingly beautiful church. And you mentioned Westminster
Yes.
in England.
Yes.
And isn't that where all the kings and queens and everybody goes?
Yeah, so good point. So so there's Westminster Abbey, right? That's Church of England. That's
All
where
right.
they just buried the Queen from.
All right.
And then there's Westminster Cathedral, which is the Catholic cathedral. That area of London is called Westminster, and so that's where those names come from.
So the first one you mentioned where the Queen is, that's Episcopalian?
Yeah, in this country, Church of England.
Church of England, all right. And then the other one would be the Catholic parish.
Yeah, the Westminster Cathedral would be the seat of the bishop.
The cathedral.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. And yeah, you were telling me that earlier, that the name, I'll get this wrong, I'm sure, but you'll correct it. The name cathedral means chair?
Yeah, that comes from the Greek word cathedra, which means chair. And it simply means that the bishop, who is the leader of the local church, has his official chair there. The chair was seen as a symbol of teaching authority. And so oftentimes, as you mentioned, St. John's is a big, beautiful church, but being a cathedral doesn't necessarily mean that it's big and huge. It typically is, but it can be a very small, humble structure, but as long as the bishop's chair is there.
And who gets to choose that?
Typically, that's in consultation with Rome, with the Pope, really, and his offices who help with that. There's some dialogue there, but for example, here in Omaha, the cathedral actually started off kind of where Conagra used to be. There was a cathedral there called St. Philomena's. As that area of town started changing, the bishop said, I think we need a new cathedral. And so they built it up where it is now, St. Cecilia's. So he had to petition Rome and say, can we move the cathedral? And they wrote back and said yes.
That was it? Just yes? No, not have a good time, send me pictures?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I haven't seen the paperwork.
Oh,
but,
okay. Yeah, there you go.
That would be the Cliff Notes edition. He wrote and they said yes.
Yes. Well, he texted it. Let's just get. He just said yes.
Yeah.
Can I build a new place? Yes.
But this was a little more complicated in the early 1900s, right?
Why?
Well, because of the lack of the internet, primarily.
Oh, I know. I knew that. But moving it was kind of a big deal because you had to go through the Vatican.
It was. And that's still the case, as populations shift, sometimes a city, for example, where the cathedral was, that used to be kind of the center of commerce and all of that, isn't anymore. And so they asked to move it to a new city so that it can be more convenient for all of the people who need to interface with that.
My guest today is Chase Becker. He's the liturgist for St. John's Parish, which is on the Creighton campus. And I love old churches. I mean, I grew up in Catholicism. The story is a little bit different depending on whether you ask the nun or me. But I think the nun threw me out of the Catholic church or out of Catholic school. And so my mother took us over to the Episcopal church. And we were there for the rest of my high school, and high school. But all my friends were over at the Catholic school. So it was great. St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Beatrice. Oh, not, well, yeah, school and church in Beatrice, Nebraska. So hi there. How are you? So you say that you love history, the history of worship.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is important. Talk to me like I'm like 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever age you want to, and tell me how worship in the Catholic Church started.
Sure.
Did I say that right?
I think that's a fair question.
Okay.
And I think that obviously, and we could go back even farther than this, I mean, Jesus and his followers were Jewish, right? And so they would have followed Jewish liturgical practices. The way they prayed, the way that they interacted with God would have been mediated through these rites, through these traditions in the Jewish world, which we are inheritors of to some degree. But I think that the starting point for us would primarily be the Last Supper, with Jesus gathering with his
Right.
apostles, breaking bread, pouring wine, and how has that been carried forward today? And I would say, in a nutshell, it started off at that very simple, very personal act of Jesus sharing that last meal with his friends and declaring that this bread and this wine is him, and asking his followers to continue to do this thing in memory of him. And when you look at how that's done, it's not exactly a nice, easy trajectory. It depends on where you were in the world and all of that stuff. But I would say, for the most part, we inherited, once Christianity became legal, we started taking on a flavor of some of the local Roman characteristics.
Oh, hold on. I'm sorry, I'm a little late. Became legal.
Yes.
Okay, we're going to take a break.
That's fair.
And that's where I want to start when we come back. Not that I'm ignorant of all of this, but I'm ignorant of all of this. So I want to hear about that. My guest is Chase Becker. He is the liturgist for St. John's Parish on the Creighton University campus. And when we come back, became legal? I always thought it was legal. But I guess when I think about the book of Acts, there was a lot of those brothers and sisters murdered for what they believed in. We'll talk about where that all started and the worship that goes with it. We'll be back in 2.5 minutes, and I'm Mac McCoy. Hey, this reminder, we have live programming every day right after Talk of the Heartland, Monday through Friday, and they're all local shows. And that's something we pride ourselves here at KCRO, making sure that we have a local voice. And I'm very familiar with the other Christian radio stations that serve our Lincoln and Omaha area, and they have very little live programming. And why does that make a difference? Well, if I can get on a pedestal for a minute, it's we love you. Just you. We don't have a nation to worry about. We don't have multiple campuses to worry about. We have one, and that's where you are. And we serve you, the local community here in Omaha, Lincoln, Council Bluffs, and in that area. And we thank you for listening to AM 660, FM 106.7 in Lincoln, and all around the world at kcro.com. 3, 2. We are back with Chase Becker. He is the liturgist at St. John's Parish on the campus of Creighton University, open to the public.
Yes.
Right? And I just, if you love, like I do, I just love old churches. And I'm not going to complain that we've gotten away from that, but we've gotten away from that. And nowadays, the churches look more contemporary, and I guess it doesn't really matter. Jesus shows up everywhere, but man, an old cathedral, what'd you say, 1871?
1887.
1887. Oh, and it's just, gosh, it's beautiful.
Those walls have been prayed in a lot.
Oh, I'll bet. And you've had, I would assume, some pretty famous funerals and weddings there.
Yes, very much so.
All right, well, we'll talk about that later. Right now, what I want to talk about is you said that when the church became legal. Tell me about that. And we're not talking about this parish. We're talking about Catholicism?
Christianity as a whole, yeah.
All right, so tell me about that.
Well, you have to remember that Christianity really began as a very small sect within Judaism, right? It was a very small, in a sense, kind of insignificant movement. But as it started gaining traction, it started to hold up some things that were very threatening to the Roman Empire, namely that the emperor was not God, which is how he saw himself.
Yes.
Right?
The Emperor of Rome.
And so, if you are the head of a nation and you have people saying that, that's causing division. And that's not something that you, as the head of a nation, want. And so the emperors of Rome set out to kind of quash this movement. And so this very small group kind of started going underground. They would have services in people's homes, again, in imitation of what Jesus did at the Last Supper, breaking bread, sharing wine, baptizing people.
I have a question. Do Jewish people have communion?
I can't speak to that exactly. I wouldn't say that contemporary Judaism is a
And it
specialization of mine.
certainly would not have been a mirror of what happened in the upper room, because that's not. I mean, that's Christianity.
Right. I mean, it took place within the context of the Passover, of which there is an element of that. But Christians would look at this in a completely different way, and that's really what Jesus did. Is he took this ritual that his followers and himself would have been familiar with as faithful Jews, and he reinterprets that to refer to himself and to perpetuate his memory amongst his followers. But as you look at kind of that trajectory, moving from this intimate meal to kind of this persecuted sect, this moves underground. If you're really interested in this stuff, the earliest known house church is in a place called Dura Europos in the Middle East. It's this house that they excavated that was turned into a clandestine church. It's a very fascinating place. In more urban
Where is it in the Holy Land?
I was afraid you were going to ask me that.
That's okay. Don't worry about it. But say the name again.
Dura Europos. It's in the Middle East.
Europos. Okay, because I'm leading a group of people over to the Holy Land this coming, we're not sure exactly the dates. We're going to say about December 27th through probably the 10th or so of January. And I'm always interested in new places, so maybe you can talk to me about that later, and we can see if we can get that on the list. All right, so go ahead. I interrupted you. I apologize.
Yeah, and so in urban places, as these early Christian communities were confronted with this kind of persecution on behalf of the government, they went underground, whether it was to people's homes or sometimes the catacombs as well. And you started seeing Christians being made really public spectacle of. Nero was setting Christians on fire, and, the Colosseum and people being devoured by, it was really horrible stuff. But the effect was, their intention was, we're going to make an example out of these people so that it'll prevent anybody from thinking that this way is a good idea. But it had the opposite effect. The witness of these early Christians and how they faced their death and the faith that they put into Jesus convinced everybody. It convinced the people in that Colosseum. It convinced those people who witnessed this going, wow, if they can face this sort of horror with such calm and with such faith, then there might be something to this. There's a saying that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church.
Oh, yeah, I would agree. Well, and Jesus told us in Scripture over and over and over, and I'm not quoting him, but you're going to be hated. You're going to be beaten. You're going to be whipped and eventually maybe killed because you follow me.
Right. And, and I think that, the message that got those early Christians in trouble, namely that, the emperor was not God, I think is something that can continue to challenge us today, mainly that a reminder to us that we are not God. It's so easy for us human beings to put ourselves at the center of our universe, and Jesus's message, I think, clearly calls us away from that.
My guest is Chase Becker today, and Chase is the liturgist for St. John's Parish, which is the parish on the campus of the University of Creighton, which is a Catholic college. Do you have a seminary there?
We do not.
You do not.
So
you'd graduate from Creighton and then go to a seminary.
You could if you wanted to, but Creighton would be is a Catholic university, but it offers all the sorts of things that a university you would expect to have. So it's not simply just religious studies. It's computers, it's healthcare, it's the humanities, it's everything under the sun. And of course, we have a number of students who have decided to pursue religious life as a priest, as a religious sister. But most of the time when people pursue that, they get an undergraduate degree from somewhere. Creighton, it could even be a secular school.
An undergraduate, is that any different in Catholicism than it is in the general secular world?
No.
Okay, so it's a 4-year school.
Correct.
3 years if you started in high school.
Yeah.
I just have to tell you, I'm so proud. I have a granddaughter who isn't even 16 yet, and she's starting to take college classes.
Wow.
So she'd like to be an attorney. And you guys have a wonderful law school.
That's
there.
right.
So maybe she'll just go straight from Papillion to being a lawyer.
Hey, there you go.
Creighton, yeah, that'd be great. I'd love that. She's just sweetheart, but don't get me going. All right, so my guest is Chase Becker. He's the liturgist for St. John's Parish and at Creighton University. For the folks that just tuned in, give us that 3-minute design of what a liturgist is.
Well, like I said earlier, if I were to put it in the most basic terms, I'm a holy event planner. I help make sure that everybody who's involved in worship, has the materials that they need, facilitating communication to make sure that all runs smoothly. But there's also an element of formation and helping people to dive more deeply into the experience of worship, which is, something that ultimately, connects us to Jesus and helps us to live in the world.
Now, you have a son who's about 4 months old, right?
Yes.
And his name is Alben.
Alban, yep.
Alben, Alben. And that's the name of one of the first martyrs in the British church.
Correct.
How will you explain that to him when he's old enough to understand?
Yeah, I think that it's ultimately a question, and it's kind of like I said earlier, we're always a part of something more than ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think Alban's story about that, about how he encountered this Christian priest and ultimately took his place when he was martyred, there's something greater than that there. How am I living on behalf of other people? Most of us will never be called to give up our lives, but the more that we're drawn out of ourselves, I think the more we find ourselves. And I think that's also something that Jesus points to, that you have to give up yourself to follow me.
Yeah, you have to die to self. That's one thing I didn't understand about Christianity. I think I told you a little bit of the story, but I was a God guy until I was 50. And the reason I was a God guy is I was born to an unwed mother and adopted by a beautiful family in Beatrice. And one Saturday before Father's Day, I was an altar boy. Is that the right term?
Yeah.
Altar boy, okay. We called them acolytes.
Sure.
All right. And the head of the acolytes department said to me, well, it's Father's Day tomorrow. What are you and your dad going to do? And I, like a smart aleck little, freckled boy, said, well, I don't have a father, but I'm going to hang around with my dad and blah, blah, blah. And this little man, Mr. Kais, I love you to death. He's been dead for many years, but what a great mentor. Turned me around, Chase, with grabbing my right arm. And when I got around, I was eyeball to eyeball with him. And he points up and he says, you do have a father, and his name is God. So the rest of my days, until I was 50, I was a God guy. And as you know from Catholicism, Jesus is many times either something in a stained glass window or a crucifix on a stick that we carry. Mm-hmm. Jesus is the head of all of our churches that Christianity is. But how do I say this? There are some that do it better than others to bring him alive.
I mean, that's the duty of every Christian.
Yeah.
Right? Is how do you take, and I guess, you could say, as you pointed out, I think perhaps for Catholics who are very, image-oriented, sometimes it can be a remote, painting or a stained glass window.
Yep.
I think for maybe some of our Protestant listeners, Jesus is a word on a page of the Bible, right?
Yes.
But I think the call for any of us is how do we take, whether it's this artwork, whether it's the sacred words of Scripture, and how do we live that in our own lives? When we're baptized into Christ. And so how do we become Christ in our day-to-day lives? How do we live? How do we interact with people? How do we be evangelists? How do we bring Jesus to this world that needs him so much?
Chase Becker is my guest today. He is the liturgist for St. John's Parish, and that is on the Creighton campus. And you also work with other parishes here in our community. Excuse me. Now, we were talking a little bit right there about what most people would call graven images. And I'm not an expert on that at all, but anybody who watches this webcast for the last 12 years has seen this picture of Jesus that I have over my shoulder here. And that's part of my testimony, that figure is. But I've never looked at it as an idol. I've never looked at it as a replacement for who Jesus is. But there are people that do that out there, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some, evangelical communities sometimes feel a little bit uncomfortable with depicting Jesus or with depicting some of the various, imagery that you might see in, say, for example, in a Catholic church. But for Catholics, it's never about worshiping an image. A stained glass window isn't a substitute for Jesus.
No.
But I think that, it's when you look at it historically, until the invention of the printing press, people weren't reading.
Thanks, Gutenberg.
Yeah, right. So, how are people being taught the stories of Christianity?
The priests are reading it in Latin.
Right. So what do? You depict it.
Yeah.
It's just like we read stories to our children. The words are very tiny, but the pictures are very big.
Well, and the stained glass windows in most cathedrals or parishes are telling the story of Jesus. If you were to walk around and have somebody explain that to all of you.
Yeah.
It's not just pictures of Jesus. It's the story of Jesus.
Right. And all of these things, point to something deeper. And that's really the goal of any artwork in the Catholic Church, is that it's never really an end in itself. It's supposed to, through music, through the visual, through whatever, to help you take those stories that you've read and maybe think about it in a new light, to maybe help uncover some reality. You think about the artists who have done this. They've clearly, studied Scripture. They've hopefully, lived Jesus's message, and they've brought that through their creative expression. It's kind of a way for us human beings to create with God, in a sense.
Yeah, and you guys have beautiful stained glass windows in that church. I don't know how to put this. I don't know if you don't have to wait for a church day, a Sabbath, or a Sunday. You guys have services twice a day, 7 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
And then on Sunday, you have an extra mass.
So, we have, the way I tell people is always check our website, just because the schedule does fluctuate with the academic year. But we have a Saturday evening mass at 5 o'clock, and then on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. and then 10:30 a.m. And then during the academic year, we have a 7 p.m. and a 9 p.m. as well. But the church is open during the day. We always welcome visitors to come, to look around, to pray, to find a place of silence. I'm in that church, pretty much all hours of the day and night with this job, and rarely is there not somebody in there. And that is so heartening to me, that there's just this oasis on campus, that students who are so surrounded with a life of noise, walking down the mall with earbuds in their ear, they're never absent from noise. But when they're in that space, it's quiet, and they can start to connect with God.
Yeah, I spent many a day sitting in. I was a part of the cathedral in Iowa, and I did exactly that. I'd come in the door, and I'd just quietly go into the area, and I would sit there and talk to God.
Yeah,
and it's I don't know why it's easier to hear him in a church, because I know that's not what he demands. But
right, and of course we can pray anywhere.
Right.
But I think that there's something for us human beings to have set aside a place that's dedicated for that.
All right, we're going to take our last break, and when we come back, Chase, Becker, and I will be here. We are talking about the history of worship, and your name came to my attention, I believe, from Sam.
Yeah, Sam Troya.
Yeah, he's a great Catholic young man, works here at the station, and I've learned a lot about Catholicism in Christian radio. And you may think, well, that's kind of odd, but I make sure that it's not odd. In fact, we hope to have a 1 hour long program on this station every week, actually moderated by Catholic priests, some of the people that are, maybe yourself will be a part of or whatever, because I think we as Christians need to understand this heritage. We never lost it from the beginning. Now, we did split denominationally, thanks to Martin Luther, but still, we're all the same blood, the same brothers and sisters, and it's good to know about the history of worship, and that's why Chase Becker is coming along for us today. I'm Mac McCoy. I want to tell you that it's no accident you're here. We've been praying for you. And what I pray is that the Holy Spirit speaks through us today, Chase or I or whoever, and that one of those prayers, whether it be an itty-bitty prayer or one of the big ones, get answered. And whether it's on this program or any other program that's here on the radio station, the answers to your prayers are being revealed to you by God. We just have to pray, and I do this every single day. Every day I say, Lord, reveal yourself to me when you bring someone beside me that I'm supposed to walk with. Because I'm a brick short of a load. And you got to keep me sharp. And I depend on you, Jesus, to do that. So it's no accident you're listening. We have been praying for you. And we thank you for listening to AM 660, 106.7 in Lincoln, and all around the world at kcro.com. We'll have about 9 minutes. And we'll be here in 3, 2. Well, here we are. We're back. I'm Mac McCoy. Thanks for listening to Talk of the Heartland here on AM 660 KCRO, FM 106.7 in Lincoln and all around the world. Anytime, 24/7 at kcro.com. Chase Becker is my guest, and he is the liturgist for St. John's Parish, which is on the campus of Creighton University. Absolutely, unbelievably beautiful church. Now, I'm going to ask a question, and I would imagine the answer to this is, oh, yes, I have. But after walking into St. John's Parish, it would be hard for me to see a more beautiful, spectacular, big Catholic church as yours is. But now you've been all around the world in Britain. Are there churches that are even more grand than St. John's Parish in Creighton?
Oh gosh, that question of what's your favorite church or what's the biggest?
Yeah.
Oh man, that's a tough one, because so often these religious structures, these churches, express the faith of the people who built them.
Yeah.
And who they are. I'm very partial to St. John's at Creighton. Even in the city of Omaha, there's very many beautiful churches, but I don't know. In where I was at in England, St. Albans, I think it was the longest church in England. But gosh, there's so many.
What was the church? And I don't remember what the situation was, but it burned down. Wasn't that over in England? And it was a huge.
Oh, Notre Dame in Paris.
Yes.
Yeah.
Was it that? That was attacked, right?
No, it was an accident in when they were doing restoring. It seemed like a worker dropped a cigarette and the roof went up in flames.
But that's why you don't smoke.
Yeah, right. But I think that's actually an interesting point that you bring that up, because if you remember back, I think that was 3 years ago. It was right before COVID, and the visceral reaction that people saw to this cathedral being on fire.